Conspiracy thinking is as old as the hills, but it was usually on the fringe, or on the fringes of society, if you will. But in our age, Bizman Hazeh, which has been characterized as the age of post-truth, with its fake news and alternative facts, conspiracism is now mainstream. It has become the focus of serious academic research and shows no signs of slowing down. The Talmud says that before the coming of the Messiah, truth will be a rare commodity. And so perhaps there is an upside to our current state of affairs. But how do we keep our heads above water? So the subtitle of tonight's program, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras, may be a helpful insight. If your head hurts, it's probably a headache and not a brain tumor. If your kid is yelling in his sleep, it's more likely to be a nightmare than the idea that a dybbuk has taken possession of your child's soul. There's always two possibilities, at least two possibilities, when you're trying to understand anything. There's the more likely scenario, and there is some incredibly far-fetched possibility. And this idea is essentially known as Occam's razor. William of Occam, 14th century Franciscan monk and philosopher, basically was the first person to express this idea that if you have two possibilities, go with the simpler and more basic explanation. The explanation that doesn't require you to go into somersaults and do an incredible tap dance through reality to arrive at an alternative explanation. This is also called the law or the principle of parsimony. And again, it means that a simpler explanation is the better explanation. For example, how did the ancients manage their feats of engineering? How were they able to build the pyramids, for example? It's quite astounding. So do we need to jump to the conclusion of someone like Eric von Daniken, who insisted that they were taught by aliens who came from outer space? Do you have to assume that was the case? Or is there another possibility for how they were able to build the pyramids? And this applies to literally every question that we face in life. What answer are you going to go with? Now, the problem is that this principle, the principle of parsimony, is routinely disregarded by conspiracy theorists. If you've ever browsed the New Age or secret knowledge section of any bookstore, you'd be familiar with the following kinds of stories. The United States never landed a spacecraft on the moon. It was all faked by NASA using a Hollywood-style film studio, and it was done to fulfill President Kennedy's promise to avoid having their budget cut if they lost the space race to the Russians. Or the claim that fluoride was not added to our drinking water to prevent tooth decay, but rather to control our minds. Again, why was fluorine put into the water? Or Princess Diana. How did she die? Was it a car accident? Or was she assassinated because she was dating a Muslim, and the British did not want a future king to be a half-brother of a Muslim? What is the explanation for almost any question we come across in life? In the same way, there was a rumor in 1969, some of you might remember, that Paul McCartney was dead, although he had just turned 64 that year. And the people claiming that Paul McCartney was dead were able to assemble hundreds of clues and pieces of evidence based upon covers of various Beatle albums and lyrics from their songs that were played forward and played backwards. The reality is that conspiracy theorists don't shy away from the evidence. That was said in jest. Conspiracy theories tend to see what's not really there, and they don't see what is actually there. These conspiracy theories are kept alive by people with a predisposition to believing them despite having to throw all facts overboard. These people exhibit a form of magical thinking, and they seize upon simple narratives to help them make sense of a confusing, complex, and frightening world. For some, these theories and ideas allow them to live with their own failures. Because after all, if there's some kind of malevolent and omniscient adversary controlling the world, it's not my fault. Now, I want to explore a few widely known conspiracy theories with you before getting into the meat of our topic for tonight. We all know, some of us in the room acutely, that there was a terrible Holocaust that took place in Europe at the hands of the Nazis. I lost half of my entire family. And usually Holocaust denial centers on 5 major issues. They claim that there was never a German plan to exterminate Jews, and not one document has ever been found detailing a master plan for genocide. Number 2, the claim is there were no gas chambers used for mass murder at Auschwitz or other camps. Number 3, the claim is that survivor testimonies and Holocaust documentation is not objective, and it's poorly recollected. Number 4, the number of Jewish deaths placed at 6 million is a gross exaggeration. And number 5, the Nuremberg trials were a farce of justice. Now, we know that Professor Deborah Lipstadt and her publisher Penguin Books were sued for libel by David Irving in the year 2000 because she referred to them as Holocaust deniers, or Irving as a Holocaust denier. And they were able to win this trial by showing a convergence of mountains of evidence for the Holocaust, including extensive written documentation by the Nazis themselves, 67 huge volumes of letters, memos, speeches, memoirs, and confessions, as well eyewitness testimony from survivors, from capos, from SS guards, from townspeople, as well photographs, military and press photographs, secret camp photographs, aerial photographs, physical evidence, including the camps and camp artifacts, and demographics, meaning that all of those who supposedly died are missing. So what techniques are used by the Holocaust revisionists? David Irving quotes from a November 30th, 1941 directive where Hitler wrote, "No liquidation of Jews." And that's supposed to be evidence that there was no Holocaust. However, Raoul Hilberg pointed out that the entire quote in this log entry read, "Jewish transport from Berlin, no liquidation." The directive was only regarding a particular transport, not about all Jews. And in reality, that transport was liquidated anyway. Either the order came too late or it was ignored. But Hitler's vetoing of a particular order of liquidation implies that liquidation was going on. Irving played fast and loose with translations of documents, claiming that the German Ausrotten meant to uproot and not to exterminate. However, this is refuted by all historical dictionaries and the way it was normally used in context. The same thing is done when Holocaust deniers quote various atlases and almanacs that were compiled before casualty numbers were available, and they show that Jewish population before and after the war were basically the same. So 6 million Jews could not have been killed. However, at the Nuremberg trials in 1945, the original estimate of 5.7 million deaths was the one that was put forward, and this number has held up for over 60 years of serious historical study based upon census figures, statistical analysis, and demographic studies. While Nazis and their admirers have striven to erase the memory of their crimes from history, it's ironic that they based their genocidal plans to some extent on a work of complete fiction. the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Now, supposedly, this was a secret minutes of a plan by Jewish leaders to enslave mankind under a yoke of Jewish domination. And they were purportedly intercepted by a Russian spy and published in 1905. Thousands of Jews were subsequently killed in resulting pogroms. In 1920, Henry Ford serialized, this is from the Ford Automotive Company, serialized the protocols in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which reached over 700,000 people. He also published hundreds of thousands of pocket editions of the protocols for wide distribution. It is still very popular among racist militias in the United States who claim that America is ruled by Zog, the Zionist occupational government. Hitler's Mein Kampf drew liberally from the protocols to justify his desire to do away with the Jews. And of course, the protocols today are extremely popular in the Islamic world. In 2002, Egyptian national television ran a 41-part historical drama based upon the protocols, and a new edition of the protocols was released in 2003 with a foreword by Ali Juma, the Mufti of Egypt. For many years, the protocols and books based upon them have been huge bestsellers in Japan because people see this idea of the Jews controlling the world as a plausible explanation for every problem in their society. However, back in 1921, Philip Graves, a correspondent for the London Times working in Constantinople, came across an old copy of a satire written in 1858 called Dialogue Between Machiavelli and Montesquieu in Hell, written by a Parisian lawyer named Maurice Joly. In this dialogue, Joly's target was actually Napoleon III, whom he has thinly disguised as Machiavelli, explaining his plots of manipulation and domination to Montesquieu. And Graves noticed how similar this work was to the protocols, with entire paragraphs lifted outright. And since then, many side-by-side comparisons have been published to document the clumsy forgery. Another source for the protocols was a novel called Biarritz. It was published in 1868 by the German writer and anti-Semite Hermann Gottschee. It was published under the pseudonym Sir John Ratcliffe. And there's a scene in it in a Prague cemetery where once every 100 years, representatives of the 12 tribes of Israel meet with the devil, and they inform him of their plans and their progress, and they ask the devil for help. Now, one common explanation that's put forward for the protocols was that they were the minutes of the first International Zionist Congress held in Basel in 1897, which again was decades after these earlier sources. And despite the fact that the protocols have been exposed and impeached numerous times, it remains one of the most influential books of the last 100 years. Ironically, the bad guys in the protocols are a mirror image, projection of all the negative elements the disseminators refuse to acknowledge about themselves. The Tsarist secret police, the Nazis, and the Islamic jihadists attribute to the Jews all of their own desires, domination of the world and extermination of their rivals. Now, one of the most widely circulating articles on the internet about the 9/11 tragedy, the destruction of the World Trade Center and attack on the Pentagon, was written by someone named Gerard Holmgren, and he observes, one of the wilder stories circulating about September 11th, and one that has attracted something of a cult following among many conspiracy buffs, is that it was carried out by 19 fanatical Arab hijackers masterminded by an evil genius named Osama bin Laden, with no apparent motivation other than they hate our freedoms. Now, Holmgren, in this very cynical comment, is not alone. There are thousands of books now that have been written and published on 9/11, numerous websites, most of them which dispute the idea of Islamic terrorists flying hijacked planes into their targets. Shortly after these events, French activist Thierry Meyssan published a book called The Frightening Fraud, asserting that the Pentagon was hit by a missile, a small plane, or a truck bomb, but not Flight 77. Similar theories maintain that the Twin Towers were brought down not by jetliners, but by controlled explosions set off within the buildings, and Flight number 93 was brought down by U.S. fighter pilots, not by heroic passengers. Of course, these plots were carried out by who? Well, either by the Mossad or engineered or allowed by the U.S. government to justify their institution of a police state and their global war efforts for oil. Just like the conspiracy theory that the U.S. knew about the Pearl Harbor attack in advance, but allowed it to happen so that we could enter World War II. Like the Holocaust, this strains the imagination to understand how these theories can thrive when we all saw the planes flying into the buildings. We heard the desperate cell phone calls, the forensic evidence, the cockpit recordings, and the meticulous planning and incessant boasting by the terrorists. And over the years, conspiracy theorists have come to include people like Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, actor Charlie Sheen, and various professors. And adherents of these conspiracy theories point to the presence of these well-educated people as proof of the validity of their claims. Now, Popular Mechanics investigated the most prevalent conspiracy theories by over 70 top professionals. For example, photos of Flight 175 just before hitting the South Tower show an object under the fuselage where no such object is normally found on a Boeing 767. So this must have been what? What's the explanation? It must have been a military pod, which was some kind of a bomb or a missile, proving this was all an inside job. However, digital analysis of high-resolution photos reveal it wasn't any kind of pod, but it was the bulge of its landing gear, which the glinting sunlight gave an exaggerated look to. Another item, a Fox News reporter was initially quoted as saying that the plane crashing into the South Tower did not look like a passenger plane since it had no windows on its sides. Therefore, it must have been not a passenger plane, but a military cargo plane packed with explosives. However, when interviewed by Popular Mechanics, the Fox reporter explained he was 2 miles away from the World Trade Center in Brooklyn when he only briefly observed the plane fly by. And when FEMA examined the collapsed towers, they found parts of the fuselage that clearly indicated that the plane had passenger windows. Another claim by the conspiracy theorists. They say jet fuel burns at between 800 and 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. Not enough to melt steel, which requires 2700 degrees. So the planes could not have caused that much damage. But the problem is that to collapse these buildings, the steel didn't have to melt, just had to lose some of its structural strength. And steel loses half of its strength at 1100 degrees. There was a demolition expert from New Mexico who observed that the buildings looked like they were brought down by explosives. He later explained that he was misquoted by conspiracy people. He never said that he believed the buildings were brought down by explosions, just that when they pancaked and ejected huge puffs of debris and smoke from their sides, they looked like explosions. Why didn't Flight 77 make a hole in the Pentagon as large as the 757's wingspan of 124 feet? So Meyssan says that this proves the building was hit by a missile, a satellite-guided missile, in a U.S. coup against itself. However, we know what happened. One wing struck the ground, and the other wing was sheared off when it hit the Pentagon's reinforced load-bearing columns, and that's why there wasn't a hole as large as the entire plane. So when it comes to conspiracy thinking, what is the basic narrative of Christianity? Well, the basic storyline is quite simple. Satan was originally an angel in heaven, and he rebelled against God and took 1/3 of the angels from heaven with him. And Satan then tempted Adam and Eve to sin, and has since then had mankind under his total control. So God took on human form in Jesus, who came as the Messiah, in order to destroy the power of Satan and redeem mankind. And by believing in this Messiah, a person's sins are forgiven, and they're given the power to live a holy life. That's the basic storyline of Christianity. And like conspiracy theories, this storyline, this narrative, is somewhat comforting because it helps make sense of a complex and frightening world and explains to us why life is so difficult. But the basic problem with this storyline is that it's not in the Bible. It may be compelling. For example, the idea that God bridged the infinite gap between himself. God is transcendent. God is totally spiritual. God is beyond this world. And how does God bridge that gap between himself, an infinite, transcendent, spiritual being, and a limited, finite, physical world? How is the gap ever bridged? And Christianity has a simple and compelling answer. God bridged the gap by God taking on human form and coming and living amongst us in this world. The problem is, despite however attractive and compelling the storyline is, it's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible never says that God is going to come to this world and take on human form. The Bible's scenario is the exact opposite. The Bible says basically that the gap between God and human beings will be bridged when human beings become more godly. And that's the entire purpose of the Torah. The Bible basically says to us, Kedoshim Tihiyu, God challenges us. You shall be holy, God says, as I, God, am holy. And so essentially the direction of the Bible is exactly the opposite of the direction of Christianity. And many Christians have come to recognize this uncomfortable fact, including both liberal and conservative Christians. For example, a missionary named Walter Riggins, in his book Yehoshua ben David, wrote, this is what the missionary writes, "Let me repeat this point. There is no self-evident blueprint in the Hebrew Bible which can be said to unambiguously point to Jesus." There's a recognition that for whatever we believe, it's not in the Bible. Another book written by Robert M. Bowman, Jr., he was actually arguing with the Jehovah's Witnesses who believe that there's no Trinity. And he wrote a book called Why You Should Believe in the Trinity. And he writes that all Trinitarians, however, agree that the ideas about God expressed in the doctrine of the Trinity are not found directly in the Old Testament. Or another missionary, Michael Rydelnik, writes in his article called Some Bad News for the Good News, which was published in the Messianic Times. He laments the fact that the recognition that the Hebrew Bible does not directly prophesy about Jesus is becoming prevalent, even among conservative Christian scholars. But the problem is that missionaries today and through all times have never let facts or reality get in the way. And they employ tortured argumentation to assert their convictions. To paraphrase Shakespeare, methinks the missionaries dost protest too much. For example, the missionary spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year promoting the claim that Jesus was the Messiah. However, the scriptures paint a clear picture of what the world will look like when the Messiah is here. Passages like Isaiah chapter 11 and Ezekiel chapter 37 explicitly tell us that when the Messiah is here, we should see the following kinds of things in the world. We should see universal peace and disarmament. We should see universal belief in the Creator, every human being, with a knowledge of God. We should see an ingathering of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. We should see all Jews observing the commandments of the Torah. This is the kind of world we should see when the Messiah is here. That's what the Bible tells us. And if we fact-check Jesus, he doesn't check out. He didn't fulfill any of the things the Bible says we should expect of the Messiah. So what do Christians do? They do something very human. They rationalize, they explain away, they apply the fudge factor. For example, they will say, Christians have peace in their hearts. Or they say, Jesus will return and he will bring peace to the world. The problem is that these rationalizations are not proofs of anything. They are desperate answers needed because the clear evidence negates their claim that Jesus was the Messiah. Christianity ultimately has no proof that Jesus was the Messiah, and their attempts to explain away and rationalize why he failed to fulfill the messianic template do not serve as evidence of any sort. Imagine you have someone trying to convince you that their best friend is the most righteous person of the generation. Imagine someone comes to you and they tell you all about their best friend, and my best friend is the most righteous person alive today. And you're surprised. You're a little bit surprised because you are familiar with this person. And you know that, for example, this person habitually gossips about others. You know that this person gives less than 1% of their net income to charity. You know this person doesn't observe many laws of the Torah, including the dietary laws and Shabbat laws. You know that this person almost never studies Torah. And this person's trying to convince you that their friend is a true saint. So you're going to point out all these deficits. You're going to point out all the evidence why it doesn't really seem so. And this person may come up with numerous far-fetched explanations for his friend's subpar behavior. But these justifications are not evidence that his friend is truly righteous. These answers are not evidence. They're just rationalizations that are needed because all of the evidence leads us in the opposite direction. It leads us to conclude that his friend is not really that righteous. So the burden of proof is on Christianity to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, and they have no such case. The only two attempts that are made in the New Testament and subsequent Christian literature don't hold up to scrutiny. The first argument made is that Jesus must have been the Messiah because of all the miracles that he did. First of all, the fact that the New Testament records his miracles is very poor evidence. The writer John, the gospel writer John, says, we're writing these stories to convince people to believe in Jesus. So he's basically admitting to you, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a historian, I'm a salesman. I'm a person who writes propaganda. I'm trying to convince others. He's telling you I'm not an objective historian. So that's one problem. But the second problem is that miracles are never cited in the Hebrew Bible as a messianic criteria. The Hebrew Bible never tells us you'll know who the Messiah is because he'll do fancy miracles. And the reason is because miracles prove absolutely nothing. We know that the miracles that Moses did in Egypt, the Egyptians could do many of those same miracles. We know that in Deuteronomy chapter 13, God tells us that false prophets will come to the world and they will be able to do unbelievable supernatural miracles. So why, indeed, does God allow false prophets to do miracles? The Bible tells us, because God is testing us to see if we're going to be misled by these false prophets and the miracles, or we're going to stay loyal to him. And even the Christian Bible acknowledges that miracles prove nothing, because Matthew chapter 24, verse 24 itself says that false messiahs will come and do incredible supernatural miracles. So all you need to do is put on your thinking cap. If false messiahs can do miracles, then obviously miracles can't prove that someone is the real Messiah. But that's the major, or one of the major arguments of the Christian Bible, that Jesus did miracles. He must have been the Messiah. And the second case made, the second argument made, is that Jesus fulfilled messianic prophecies. So again, the reality is that he didn't fulfill any messianic prophecies. If you were to assemble all the things that are genuine messianic prophecies that everyone agrees upon, even Christians and Jews will agree that Isaiah chapter 11 and Ezekiel chapter 37, all the prophecies about the world becoming a place of the knowledge of God and peace and the ingathering of the exiles, everyone agrees those are messianic prophecies. And Jesus didn't fulfill any of them. What about the passages that Jesus did fulfill? Well, the reality is that virtually none of them are messianic prophecies. They are prophecies or they're passages in the Bible about other things, and the Christian rubber stamps it as messianic prophecy. And the analysis of these prophecies is based upon circular reasoning. So just as a simple example, the Christians claim that the Hebrew Bible tells you that you'll be able to recognize the Messiah because he's going to be crucified. Where in the world does the Jewish Bible say that? So they point to a passage in Psalms which they translate as, they pierced my hands and feet, they pierced his hands and feet. So first of all, that's a mistranslation. It doesn't say that. Even the Christians now are acknowledging it's a mistranslation. Ka'ari yadai v'raglai, like a lion at my hands and my feet. There's nothing in that psalm that tells you it's about the Messiah. There's not any context which tells you it's about the Messiah. And even if it was about the Messiah, right? How do you know it's talking about Jesus? There were 100,000 Jews who were crucified. You have to assume the conclusion and then say it applies to Jesus. You have to begin by assuming Jesus was the Messiah, and look, these verses point to him. But there's no, as I mentioned before, there's no self-evident evidence in the Hebrew Bible that Jesus was the Messiah. There's absolutely zero evidence. So there's a famous parable that's told about a scientist who was experimenting with a butterfly. And he clipped one leg of the butterfly and shouted, "Jump!" And the butterfly floated up in the air. He then caught the creature and tore off another leg. And again he shouted, "Jump!" And the butterfly scrambled but still sprang up into the air. Then the scientist clipped one of its wings and did the same shouting. And the butterfly this time tried to move but could not really do so. But it flapped one of its wings desperately. The scientist was excited. He clipped the other wing too. And then he yelled, "Jump!" And the butterfly was still. And the scientist noted his inference in his notebook. After cutting two wings and legs, the butterfly cannot hear. This is a classic trap that we walk into. The human mind cannot live in peace until it makes up a story out of disconnected dots around it. And unfortunately, the real dots of significance never come alone, but are always surrounded by plenty of noise, false dots. The human mind, in a hurry to connect the dots, often ends up connecting the wrong dots and making up a wrong story. And we love stories. We love the stories we make up in our minds. In a while, such stories become part of our identity, our ego. And finally, we begin to live in a world that does not really exist. I'm often shocked when I see how missionaries consistently connect the wrong dots. They get so caught up in the narrative that they've embraced that all logic gets thrown out the window when it comes to the efforts they make to support their narrative. One missionary who is an Israeli now living in the U.S. put out a video a few years ago where he was sitting breathlessly with a volume of the Talmud in front of him and saying that he found proof that the ancient rabbis believed in Jesus. And he referenced the passage from the tractate Baba Kama, page 80a, where it says that Rav and Shmuel and Rav Asi attended a meal celebrating a circumcision. It's called Bei Shavua, the week, because it's after a week the circumcision takes place. And then the Talmud says that according to another version of the story, they were going to a Pidyon Haben, which takes place 30 days after the birth of an Israelite child, where the father gives 5 silver coins to a Kohen, to a priest. And the Pidyon Haben celebration is called Bei Yeshua Haben. And he saw the words Yeshua Haben, and his eyes lit up. Because Christians, some of them at least, believe that Jesus' Hebrew name was Yeshua, even though there's no evidence that this was the case. And that here he claims the rabbis were acknowledging that he's the Son. It says Yeshua Haben. Just like Christians do. They speak about the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so this missionary says, you see, the rabbis themselves acknowledge that Jesus is the Son. Of course, this passage in the Talmud is not speaking about Jesus. It's about going to a celebration that's either called a Bei Shavua, a circumcision ceremony, or a Bei Yeshua Haben, to a place where they're having a Pidyon Haben. And today we call the Pidyon Haben exactly that, Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the Son. But the word Yeshua also means redemption. So there were those who called what we refer to as a Pidyon Haben, they referred to as Yeshua Haben. And after his blunder was exposed, this missionary deleted the video from his YouTube channel. Now, I recently saw another video where this same missionary was interviewing another Jew who had converted to Christianity and who is now a missionary himself in Israel. And this fellow explained how he came to believe in Jesus. He grew up in the U.S., and he was a fairly traditional Jew, and he had been going to synagogue regularly, but now in college, he also began attending meetings of a Christian student organization. So he says, I watched the interview, he says in synagogue that week, they were reading the end of Sefer Bereshit, the end of book of Genesis, where it describes Jacob blessing his grandchildren, Manasseh and Ephraim, the 2 sons of Joseph. And it says in chapter 48, verse 16, "May the angel who redeems me from evil bless the lads, and may my name be declared upon them, and the names of my forefathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they proliferate abundantly like fish within the land." And the word for proliferate abundantly like fish is vayidgu, has the word dag in the middle. Dag is fish. And he says that week he went to a meeting of this campus Christian group, and they were studying Matthew chapter 4. And he says they were reading verses 18 to 20, and I'll read you what it says. It says, Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, and he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew. And they were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Come, follow me, and I will make you the fishers of men." And at once they let down their nets, and they followed him. So this missionary said, you see, there was fish there, back in the story in Genesis, because Jacob said that they should increase like fish, and there's fish here. I'm going to make you the fishers of men. And that story was about 2 brothers, Manasseh and Ephraim, and this story is about 2 brothers, Peter and Andrew. And he said, I'm quoting now, "And that just connected with me." That just connected with me, meaning that I connected these dots. Now, why would these 2 men, I'm quoting from him now, why would these 2 men get up and leave their professions and their families? Why would they do that? So he says, because when Jesus said, "I'll make you the fishers of men," they understood that he was the Messiah. Why? So this fellow claims that the blessing in Genesis chapter 48 was about the Messiah, because it speaks about the angel who redeemed me from all evil. And the missionary says, who redeems us from all evil? It's only the Messiah. So he says, that impacted me. And from that, I came to faith in Jesus. I was convicted by truth. What incredibly muddled thinking. Sure, both stories have the word fish, although one says fish and one says fisher, a fisherman. And both stories involve brothers. But first of all, Genesis is not about the Messiah. Jacob is speaking about an angel that God sent to redeem him and to rescue him. And Scripture often speaks about God's angels who protect us. For example, in the famous passage from Psalm 91, verse 11, not just an angel, but angels that God sends to protect us. And even if it's true that the Messiah will somehow rescue us from evil, why is Jesus the Messiah all of a sudden? Because he used the word fisherman. He didn't even say the word fish. Jacob, first of all, was using the word fish as a metaphor for proliferating and multiplying the children who will grow. Jesus was speaking about fishermen, that you're going to become the fishers of men. You're going to go out and bring people into my movement. But Jesus had not redeemed anyone from anything. The fact that the Messiah, he claims, is supposed to redeem people from evil, why does that make Jesus the Messiah? Because he used the word fish? And that connects back to what Jacob said? And Jacob was speaking about a redeemer? So it's one thing if Jesus actually had redeemed the whole world from evil, and you could say, oh, I guess this is the Messiah maybe. But Jesus had not done anything, had not yet even done a miracle. And this fellow, who's now a big missionary in Israel, he's explaining that's how he came to faith in Jesus. He was convicted by the truth that Jesus must have been the Messiah, because he used the word fish here. It boggles the imagination. Saul Bellow once said, a great deal of intelligence can be invested in ignorance when the need for illusion is deep. You see, the reality is that Christians are perplexed and challenged by the failure of Jewish people to accept Jesus. And that's why they invest so much effort and money specifically to reach Jews. Their efforts and programs to reach Jews is way out of proportion with their efforts to reach everyone else in the world, because we bother them. Because the failure of Jews to accept Jesus basically is a question in the credibility of Jesus. So how did Christians deal with the failure of Jews to accept Jesus? So there have been two theories over the course of Christian history. The Christian Bible says the Jews are blinded by Satan. I've heard this many times from Christians. Once when my wife and I were going to visit Israel, we were in a sherut going to Jerusalem from the airport, and there were two Christian ladies in front of us, and we overheard them saying exactly this. Oh, they will never understand. They have scales covering their eyes. They're blind. That's one possibility. That might explain why I don't believe in Jesus, because Satan has blinded me. And then there was another theory. Not that the Jews were victimized or blinded by Satan, but the claim is that the Jews are Satan. Who else but the devil could be so evil to know the truth and to deny it? They think that the Jews know that Jesus was the Messiah, but we're so evil that we deny the truth that we know. Who could be so evil to deny the truth they know but the devil himself? And I've been called the devil. I've been called Satan. I've been called all these names. These are two answers commonly given by Christians to explain why is it that Jews don't accept Jesus. But is there another possibility? Is there another possibility why Jews did not accept Jesus? A more likely possibility. Don't forget Occam's razor. Don't forget the law of parsimony. Don't forget when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Is it that we're blinded by the devil? Is that we are the devil? Or could it be that we're right? Could it be that Jews understand what the Messiah is supposed to do, what the Messiah is supposed to be, and it wasn't Jesus, as clear as that. And the Bible predicts, the Bible tells us that the world will one day see this. The prophet Isaiah says several times that the Jews are to be a light to the nations. And the prophet Isaiah basically ends in chapter 60, a little bit before the ending of his book, where he says, one day the world will come to the light of the Jewish people. The prophet Jeremiah says in chapter 16, the nations will come one day from the ends of the earth, and they will admit that their ancestors inherited nothing but falsehood. This is what the Bible says. And the prophet Zechariah says in chapter 8, that in those days 10 people from every nation of the world will grab hold of the garment of a Jew, and they'll say, we want to follow you. We've heard that God is with you. The Bible never tells us that one day the Jews are going to wake up and admit that they were wrong and the Gentiles have been right all this time. The Bible tells us the exact opposite, that one day the nations of the world are going to wake up and they're going to admit the Jewish people are right, they have the truth, and we have to go now and listen to them.